My name is Mehek Dagar and I'm Kenyan, but I'm South Asian too. So what does that mean for me? Like any other South Asian in the country, our history has slowly faded over time. Through this documentary, we seek to understand the heritage of our forefathers in the South Asian community.
I have had no problem whatsoever in declaring myself as a Kenyan South Asian. Unfortunately, I would rather say I'm just Kenyan.
I wear the Kenyan band to identify myself that I'm a Kenyan. No one can take it away from me, even if I wasn't born in Kenya. But Kenya was born in me. You can't take that away from me.
My father didn't consider himself an Asian. He considered himself an African. He was born here. He knew this continent better than most indigenous Africans, if you want to call it that. But he never saw any difference. He knew this was his home.
The story of the South Asian community in Kenya begins with their journey across the Indian Ocean, leaving behind their homes. Their journey would take them across the ocean, navigating difficult seas and enduring long voyages before finally arriving in the land they would call home. They arrived in Kenya, a land that was then under British colonial rule. Over time, they established themselves in Kenya, building homes, businesses, and communities.
It's a very long history because the Sikhs or the Indians did not start coming to East Africa only as recently as 1890s, but they have been known to trade with the East African coast for thousands of years, coming from Bombay and Gujarat to the East African coast, especially Mombasa, to trade, as did the other countries like Oman or the Portuguese or the Chinese.
When we think of independence in Kenya, we think of Jomo Kenyatta, Achieng Oneko, and the Mau Mau. But who you don't hear about as often are the likes of Manilal Desai, Pio Gama Pinto, Alibai Mullah Jivanji, and Makhan Singh. These are prominent individuals among the South Asian community who are at the forefront of the fight of Kenya's independence.
Things picked up, particularly in the 1950s. In fact, when Africans outrightly came together with the Indians, particularly the Indians who supported the African cause. One of them is a gentleman called Ambubai Patel, popularly called Ambu Patel. Ambu Patel was a personal friend to Mzee Kenyatta. In fact, it is said that when Mzee Kenyatta was arrested in 1952 and taken to prison, taken to trial and subsequently imprisoned, a number of the members of the Kenyatta family were taken care of by Ambu Patel.
Jomo Kenyatta was arrested. He was also taken to Lokitong. But when they could see that my father and Jomo Kenyatta were, waving at each other for this thing, my father was moved to Maralal. And from there, Maralal again, he spent quite a few years. And then finally he was released from Dol Dol in 1961. 2 months after Kenyatta was released, see. So they tried to deport my father with the incentive that, look, we can release you, but you must go to India, and we'll pay for all this thing, and there'll be no, as long as you don't come back. And my father, of course, flatly refused. He says, I'm not going to go, I'm going to stay. Wherever I am, I'm not going to move out of this place. So you see, during that period, he drafted very important books on the trade union movement in this country in 2 volumes. It is called The History of Trade Union Movement, going back, I think, to 1925, 26, or 7, this thing, and so on and so forth. And the second volume was for 2 years, 2 or 3 years period. So he did most of the writing and most of this thing and finished it in that thing. When he was released, so as I said, his political role has been both union, bringing up the uplifting the Africans, and of course politics in this thing. When he was released in 61, Jomo Kenyatta and the other 5, 6, they all went to our Park Road home, ancestral home, to receive him.
In 63, when we did become independent, I remember dancing in Mombasa Stone grounds at midnight when we saw the flag go up. Okay? So it was a great moment for us. But then, very soon after that, we began to experience a kind of anti-Asian sentiment, you know, both largely from the government actually of the day, the newly independent government, and some of the population. And that really was quite a shock, because up to that point we had struggled together, or so I thought, to achieve this independence. And suddenly the whole mood had changed, you know, and we were now being seen as an obstacle to African advancement in the country. So for me first, I'm now talking to me personally, it was a very rude shock, and I couldn't understand what had happened and all that. And I had to make sense of it. And the only way I could make sense of it was to understand or try and find out our own history. And what right did we have to say that we were Kenyans equal to any other Kenyan in this country?
In the efforts of telling these untold stories, journalists played a key role in the documentation of the independence period and the persons involved, even to the extent of putting their lives online. Muhammad Amin, popularly known as Mo Amin, is celebrated up to date for his fearless storytelling.
The best thing that I think I can leave behind is to have his content available in a format that generations of young Africans can learn the true history of this continent, whether it's in the form of speeches, whether it's in the form of still photographs, whether it's in the form of newspaper articles, but in an audiovisual, interactive way, they can learn the history of this continent using his content, which will immortalize his memory as well, and his name, and his contribution to the things that he did, and hopefully will change the way young Africans see this continent. Because if they knew the real history, the real vision of our founding fathers and what they had in mind for this continent, I think it will help us get to that place and help young people build on that vision to make this continent one of the greatest places on the planet.
The South Asian community is well known for the Kenya-Uganda railway construction. This later led to the establishment of businesses alongside the railway tracks, which, as you may know, are referred to as dukans or dukas in Swahili. Over the years, the South Asian community has contributed massively to the Kenyan economy.
By the time we gained independence, because of the developments of the colonial era, Kenya's post-colony witnessed a dominant economic class of Indians. And David Himbara, in his book, Kenyan Capitalists, has documented this. These did not go down well with the immediate post-colonial Kenyan administration. This resulted in two main things. One, The 1968 Trade and Licensing Act, which officially excluded Indians from certain commercial activities and certain areas both in Nairobi and upcountry towns. For example, the Indians were banned from doing retail business. In fact, many Indian families basically lost their retail business in Biashara Street and many other areas. They were asked to confine themselves to one, manufacturing, and then wholesale. You know, they were not supposed to operate, for example, in the central business district of Nairobi. They were not allowed to venture into business, particularly to many upcountry places. If you were in Nairobi, you were confined to Nairobi. And that, so the migration of Indians from Kenya, many of them to the UK, a number of them went to India. But of course, a number of them persevered and stayed on until the 1980s, you know, late 1970s, early 1980s, when it was increasingly becoming clear that the Trade and Licensing Act of 1967-1968 did not bear much fruit as they were thought, other than, of course, empowering a few African elites to get into business.
Post-independence in Kenya ushered in underground movements, some run by South Asians in the country, that advocated for equality, anti-racism, and trade unionism, among others. This was not taken lightly by the Kenyan government, as some of those involved in the movements became victims of harassment, imprisonment, and even exile.
It was really the underground struggle and the people's struggle that really pushed the dictatorship to give in. They had no choice, you know, and we didn't get it on a platter, and we lost many of our comrades who were tortured in Nyayo House, people who got involved in the underground struggle. And then I think the many lawyers and journalists, you know, who took part. I mean, if you look at that group of people who worked around, there was Gitobu, there was Kamau Kuria, you know, there were other prominent Kenyans. I mean, there are people who today, you know, people don't talk about, but many there. I mean, today if there is a list of, I know, over 200-300 people and more who got involved and who were arrested by the Moi regime. Now, that group of people and that movement is what I was part of, and that's what my identity is.
Growing up in Kenya and being aware of my community's presence here, my identity has always been a big deal for me. I find comfort in the fact that I can share these sentiments with other young people of my generation. I sit down with a friend to discuss about this further. Thank you for joining us today to have this talk about growing up as a South Asian in Kenya. I believe that we share the same sentiments, considering we're both first-generation Asians in the country. Why don't you tell us about your experience growing up here?
My name is Mitesh Parsani, and I am a first-generation Indian living in Kenya. At the moment, I'm a Kenyan citizen, and I come from a community called the Kachi community, which is basically a subculture of the larger Gujarati community. And I've been born and brought up here, but my parents were born, raised, and educated in India, and they decided to move here in the approximately early 1990s before they went back, and then they came back again around 1996, 97, somewhere around that period. And ever since they've been here, and I was born in 2001 here, after which I pursued my education, everything from start to end, and here at the University of Nairobi today. So yeah, essentially I've been brought up here.
So I share similar experiences as you. My grandmother was born here during colonial times, and she married off to India, where my dad was born and brought up. They moved here in around the 1990s. And of course, then I was born in 2000. I have grown up here, I have been educated here, and I also work here. So what has it been like for you and for your identity as you were growing up, you know, living in an Asian household, but also living in Kenya?
Right, so that's like living completely two different lifestyles. So essentially what happened is I was living a different life at home, and when you get out of the house, you tend to live a different life. Mm-hmm. Though that was very apparent when I started my nursery and junior kindergarten and the likes. So I used to come I studied in a school called Waridi Day International School Waridi Day School in Westlands. That's where I did my nursery. So I had very few people from my culture that were there, right? So it was just me and this other kid that we just used to talk, and everyone else was Kenyan. And that meant that I was living a completely different life when I went to school. After that, I happened to join my community school, which is Shri Kachileva Samaj School. And that's why I started in class 1 there, and I did my primary, my secondary, and my A-levels in that school. So that felt like a bit more of cultural and home to me, because that was the majority population in that school. So that was a different experience. But what happened is, because I came from a different kind of background when I was in school in nursery, when I joined primary in Samaj, I tended to merge with a friends group that was not from my community, despite my community being the majority of the school. So that's what happened eventually. But when I reached secondary, I started forming more relationships and friend circles with people from my community, and at that moment I felt like I had a complete change in my lifestyle. So now I started speaking vernacular in school, but in a good proportion that the teachers wouldn't shout back at you, right? And it went on and on. Eventually, there's that inner circle you're with in school, and then there's the outer circle. So my inner circle was still friends that were not from my community. And unlike my community, which loves playing cricket, I used to be someone who used to play football and do swimming and things like that. But when you go home again, my dad's a fanatic of cricket, so I used to watch cricket. But when you're coming to school, all you're doing is talking about football. So again, that engaged me in different sports. I think it is when I came to reach class 11 or my A-levels is when I started connecting further deeply with my community. All this time, yes, we used to travel to India for family vacations, meeting family and the likes. So it used to be exciting in that sense. But I think it is when I came to maybe class 10 or 11 is when I started really figuring out, more things about my community, started being more involved in community events, going to the community center more often, which is located in Nairobi West, doing things with the community, indoor sports, and connecting them with them more. And I think that's when I became more integrated with my community here, and I love it. It's absolutely fantastic. That being said, when I go out, there isn't much of a community out there, right? Because, you're in the midst of local Kenyans who have been born and brought up here, and they're not from my community. So when I go out, you're adapting to that lifestyle. Like when I'm coming to university, I'm adapting to that lifestyle. But when I'm at home or within my community, or I'm just chilling with a couple of friends, I tend to be with, my community. So a sort of two lives.
I think we share a very similar experience, because when I was growing up, I went to a school called Loreto in Valley Road, and it was predominantly, the local Kenyans, and I was the only Indian. So I was there for about 6 years, and I moved to an Indian high school. And the shift that you also felt as you moved from, a local, to call it so, a local primary school, to one that's like community based. I also realized that I was living two different lives, but it was very easy for me to shift between those two different lives. And I believe that's where my identity, or what I felt about myself growing up, stemmed from. So usually when people ask me who I am or what I am, I tend to feel more Kenyan than I feel Indian. Do you feel the same way?
Absolutely. Actually, when I joined university, now that was the time when I've actually come out of my cocoon, because at the university, at my campus, there's literally no one from my community. And I'm entering a class of 300 to 400 students, and everyone, all eyes are just on me, because you're the odd one out, obviously. So when you start talking to a few people, the first question they ask is, oh, are you Kenyan? Or are you Indian? Or, are you Muindi? And those kind of conversations are how everything usually started. When I started getting to events, to programs within the university, that was, again, the most predominant question, and they're just verifying my identity. To be honest, sometimes it's a bit tricky for myself. What do I really identify as? But I feel I'm really more Kenyan than Indian. So whenever they would ask me, what are you? I would say Kenyan. And after that, it sort of became I was very okay with them asking me So when you're having a conversation with someone and I'm speaking in Swahili or Sheng, and then someone else would be passing from nearby, they just know me a bit, and then they hear me speaking Swahili or Sheng, they'll be like, you can speak Swahili? Oh wow, really? I thought you were from outside. And so that kind of, it's sort of a culture shock when you're interacting with someone new, and so I don't entirely blame them, but sometimes it can be a bit pestering. But it's totally fine, you know, it's good to understand cultures, and it's an exciting experience. So when going to these events, it's good to see, you know, people who are willing to learn, and they're those that will be very happy of connecting with you. And eventually the conversation just picks up, and now it's no longer about culture, it's no longer about you being a South Asian, it's just about you two knowing each other in your professional or like a professional capacity or as friends, and life moves on like that.
As both of us are in our 20s, right, and we're like the oncoming generation now, we were declared Tribe 44 in 2017, if I'm not wrong. That declaration means different things to different people. And for us, as the future now of our community's generation, right, what do you feel about that? What do you think our future looks like?
Right. A lot of changes have happened ever since that period. I think the 2010s should be the most moving ones, the most critical ones. So, of course, there were the different channels that came out. So they were more, well, they were early Indian radio stations, but then after that a few others came up. There was an Indian newspaper that came out that you work at. So those kind of changes were very subtle, but they brought out, you know, showcasing the community, various Asian communities across Kenya. That's fantastic. Where I see us going forward, specifically for my community, the primary source of business, or income rather, the primary business and the main source of income is usually based in the construction industry. So you either own a construction company, or you are a subcontractor of some kind in the same industry, or you're selling hardware and tools in the same industry. And so it was a very saturated industry. But what's happening to these guys is, okay, the guys coming with, what the guys running the construction related businesses are all people that have moved from India. And then we're coming in as the first generation, so now they're children. They're doing a variety of courses, right? So medicine, other types of engineering. So, well, full disclosure, my brother did civil engineering as well, and that was his passion, so he pursued it. But prior to that, it was mostly because your dad is doing this, you have to do this. Well, that's sort of changing. People are moving to medicine, people are moving to journalism, people are moving to economics and statistics, and various kind of fields, accounting and the like. So that's another significant change that might happen, and again, that might help us integrate better, because seeing someone probably in a studio from a South Asian origin is going to be a culture shock temporarily. But I think we've had you know, TV hosts and presenters, Shiksha Arora or the likes of Smriti Vidyarthi, they have this South Asian origin. So that kind of barrier is being broken down. Seeing someone working in a government office, probably like me, who's from a South Asian origin, will be a big culture shock for some people. But a few generations down the line, that thing will no longer be a problem. And as people diversify into different industries, I feel like they'll be breaking down this stereotypes, and there will be this bit of spreading the risk within the community. So essentially, that's the whole goal. Make sure you're diversified into different industries so your culture remains and you continue coexisting with the locals around.
So I think I share the same sentiments as you, and I do believe that as we move forward, there's more chances for our community that's been so cocooned to open up and integrate more better with the locals here. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your sentiments and experiences with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It was really exciting being part of this interview and hacking a bit into my own history. It's been exciting, and I really hope such conversations continue and we get to be within the larger part of the Kenyan community, not seen as the 44th tribe, but as one Kenyan community much sooner than, 4 generations or 5 generations down the line.
We hear our stories from our grandparents and parents. However, it is now our responsibility to pass them down and preserve them. I hope after watching this documentary, we can look into our own identities and tell our own stories of our own times.